Good morning and welcome to the 31st meeting in 2024 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. Fulton McGregor, Willie Coffey and Martin Griffin are joining us online today. And I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. The first item of our agenda is to decide whether to take items 5, 6, 7 and 8 in private. Are members agreed? We're agreed. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence on the annual report of the Ethical Standards Commissioner for 2023 to 24, and we're joined for this item by Ian Bruce, who is the Ethical Standards Commissioner. And I welcome you to the meeting. And there's no need to turn your microphone on and off, as we'll be doing that for you. And I'd like to begin by inviting you to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener and members of the committee, for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk to you about the work of our office. I'm going to keep the statement brief to allow as much time as possible for questions. I trust that you've reviewed our last annual report alongside the briefing papers provided to you for today's meeting, and that this will have given you an indication of the continuing progress that we have made as an office since I last gave evidence to the committee in December of last year. As the committee will be aware from evidence I've provided previously, I prefer to rely on external, independent validation of my work. The missing piece of the jigsaw is Audit Scotland's report on the 2023-24 reporting year, which was published just last week, so that was too late for inclusion in your papers for today. I've provided a copy to the clerks to the committee in case the details in it are of interest to you. Audit Scotland again conducted a wider scope review, and that was to provide assurance on our governance and other aspects of our work that had previously been of concern. The headline findings were that the Commissioner's Office operated within its approved budget for 2023-24. Appropriate medium-term financial planning arrangements are in place, which demonstrate how services will continue to be delivered. A new strategic plan with clear objectives for improvement and a more strategic-looking senior management team are in place. Open and transparent governance arrangements are operating effectively. The vacancies we were carrying have been filled and increased capacity is making a difference. And complaints handling performance is improving and positive developments have been implemented to tackle the waiting list. Additionally, they found good evidence that our arrangements demonstrate best value as required by the Ministerial Guidance to Accountable Officers for Public Bodies and the Scottish Public Finance Manual. I'm pleased to say that the auditors for the second year running had no recommendations for us. I was also provided with additional assurance this year by our internal auditors, and they reviewed our cybersecurity arrangements and assessed our controls as substantial, and we managed to obtain Cyber Essentials Plus reaccreditation this year too. Our financial arrangements were rated as strong, and the auditors also reported positively on our work on implementing their prior recommendations. I trust that this is of interest to the committee, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that the members may have.
Thanks very much for giving that statement and highlighting all the kind of key points. There's quite a lot of different bits to keep track of, isn't there, in the work? Not just what you're actually doing, but also the kind of backbone administration and the cyber security aspects. So we do have a number of questions just to tease out a bit of detail. I'd like to begin with a question around the number of complaints about councillors. So during 2023 to 24, the number of complaints about councillors more than doubled compared with the previous financial year. So we're looking at 344 versus 156. And I'd be interested to hear if you could explain your thoughts on the reason for this rise and whether we should be worried about ethical standards in local democracy.
Goodness. I'll maybe answer the second question first. I think we should all be worried about ethical standards in local democracy. Some of this may appear anecdotal, but clearly we've got the numbers that sit under that as well. But yes, it's concerning to me. I've been in this post a year and a half as Commissioner, 2 years as Acting Commissioner, and the impression I get is that standards are not great, and that certain issues certainly are driving up complaint numbers. it may be of interest to the committee to know that even geopolitical events, so things like the conflict in the Middle East and political commentary on it, drives complaint numbers up, even though clearly that's not necessarily directly relevant to local communities. Perhaps a bit closer to home, debates on contentious matters. So a good example, I think, would be the debate that continues to go on in respect of the rights of those who identify as transgender and those who hold gender-critical views. That drives a fair number of complaints to our office. And then over and above that, there are other matters which are perhaps more local to particular areas. So things like contentious planning decisions drive up complaint numbers, and the financial constraints that councils face and some of the very challenging decisions that they're having to make given that financial climate. So, for example, cuts to services, all of these things drive up complaint numbers as well. Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, so I mean it's quite strong in a way that you're saying that we should be worried, and it's good to hear some of the reasons, both on a kind of global level, but also at a local level, planning decisions and so on and so forth. So quite a bit of these complaints come off the basis of the Councillor Code of Conduct. And I'd be interested to hear from you in what way you think awareness of the Code of Conduct could be raised among non-politicians that could then stem the flow of some of the inadmissible complaints that you received. I think it's something like 80% of them were inadmissible.
Sure. I'm not so. I think where the issue lies there is in the main, because most of our complaints do continue to come from members of the public, so it's about 80% in that reporting year. We did see, and I think possibly significantly, a rise on councillor complaints that year as well, so it rose from 10% to 17%, so the share of complaints went up. But I think the Standards Commission, who you'll hear from later, does a very good job in terms of education and guidance, etc. And they work alongside the Improvement Service, helping councillors to understand what the provisions of the code are and when it applies and when it doesn't. So I think in the main our issue is with members of the public. So we're doing more ourselves in order to improve awareness levels, because quite a lot are inadmissible, and the sorts of things that they tend to complain about, and whether or not raising their awareness would preclude them from complaining about these issues, I don't know, but we'll certainly have a go. But it's things like council decisions or the service that they receive from their local councillor, how frequently they respond to emails, whether they respond to emails, whether or not they're doing exactly what the constituent wants them to do. These are the sorts of things that that tend to be inadmissible, and the code simply doesn't apply in those cases. Again, the Standards Commission produces guidance, and they came up with a very helpful piece of guidance that councillors can use in discussions with their constituents, and that's about when the code applies, and helping constituents to understand that these aren't conduct issues, they're really performance issues. For our own part, we've just drafted 3 new easy read guides, which we're just about to publish on our website, and they do explain in the very simplest terms this is what you can and can't complain about. So we're hoping that will make a difference. And over and above that, we've just refreshed our communications strategy, and that was following the publication of our new strategic plan. And we're certainly our intent at the moment is to put more accessible information into the public domain via LinkedIn and YouTube. So short videos, etc., to try and help the public to understand what our role is, what the ethical standards framework is, and when the code does and doesn't apply to the work of councillors. So yeah, there's definitely an education piece, I think, involved in that. I have to say social media as well. So again, you'll have seen from the annual report and accounts, I think it was 20% the prior year. It's gone up to 25% now of the complaints we receive do relate to social media commentary. And sometimes the code is engaged in relation to that, and sometimes it isn't. But it can be quite an unpleasant environment. And if a councillor raises their head above the parapet and does engage in debates, that certainly can generate complaints from members of the public.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting to get that detail there. I just wonder if there's something that could be done where when we move towards an election, for example, local authority election, maybe something could be sent along with that kind of information that comes from what do they call, the Board of Elections, so that your guides, like QR codes or something. But that's not for me to come up with those solutions. It just popped into my mind, though.
No, it's a very helpful point, and it may be helpful to point out that both myself and the Standards Commission, we wrote collectively to the leaders of all political parties in the run-up to the last election, just to remind the members of those parties of the importance of adhering to the provisions of the code. We'd anticipated there may be a spike in complaint numbers just prior to the election. It didn't materialise. Perhaps that letter made a difference. It's hard to tell.
Yeah. Great. Thanks very much. I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey, who's joining us online. He's got a couple of questions. Willie.
Thank you very much, Convener. We're waiting for the audio to come on. Ian, thanks very much for those opening remarks. And it's really in the same area to ask you about why so many councillors complain about one another and when you might expect to see the fruits of the guidance being embraced and adopted by our local authority councillors. And could you maybe just talk a wee bit as well about whether that's a mandatory part of councillor training to be aware of the issues that are conduct issues rather than performance issues, as you described. So maybe just give us a little flavour of that to widen the discussion a bit, if you can.
Yes. So in answer to your first question, I think one of the key issues that's driving it is the very, very challenging circumstances that local authorities find themselves in financially. Councils are finding themselves having to make very difficult decisions in respect of service provision, and this is leading to debates which on occasion are becoming personalised. We do see, for want of a better expression, hotspots across the country as well, where councillor-on-councillor complaints are very prevalent, and those drive the numbers up. So I'm not going to say it's across the board. I don't think it is. And by and large, conduct's fairly good, but the numbers kind of speak for themselves. We have seen that increase, and when very, very difficult decisions have to be made, and there are political disagreements, things can become quite fractious. Now that's wholly understandable. Where it becomes problematic and where the code becomes engaged is where discussions lapse into personal attacks as opposed to basically attacks or challenges on policy positions that particular councillors have to take. And I think it's that key distinction that it's very important for councillors to realise. By all means, criticise the policy positions of your political opponents, but please do not personalise it. As to whether training should be mandatory, sure, one could certainly make a case for that. I think in my experience, because I've been running training in all sorts of areas for a long time, those who tend not to need it tend to be the ones who are most keen to come along and participate. So there would potentially be scope to make training mandatory. And we know that practices vary from local authority area to local authority area. How one would ensure that it sticks is another matter. And perhaps, if you were going to go down that route, consideration should be given to whether or not one assesses the extent to which people have taken on board the training that they've received. So, you know, like for example, some training is available to people online, and you know, you can tick a box to say, well, I've watched that presentation, but whether or not that's actually going to moderate your behaviour into the future would be a different question. I hope that helps. But
it certainly does, Ian. Thanks. Are you spending a lot of your time basically dismissing complaints that don't fall within the scope of the conduct? Could you just give us a little flavour of the amount of work you actually do by simply dismissing things that are not relevant?
Yes, it's a considerable amount of work. I mean, you know, so it was in the region of 60% in the last reporting year, and it's sitting at roughly that level again. And it depends. It varies from complaint to complaint. But some complainants do, because they're fundamentally unhappy. They do deluge us with a considerable amount of material. You know, it can run into hundreds, sometimes even thousands of pages. And all of that needs to be reviewed in order for us to assess whether there's actually any merit to that particular complaint. You know, we do have to be thorough. Because there's an obligation on us, both to complainers and respondents, to ensure that we've properly assessed the concerns that they bring to us. But sometimes at the end of that process, we do find that there's actually no merit to that complaint. So yes, there is a fair amount of work involved.
Thanks. Ian, you'll also be aware that this committee recently agreed to support the recommendations from the Remuneration Committee on Councillors' Pay, and so you'll be aware of that. Do you think there might be an opportunity there to take that further forward, to include more mandatory elements within the councillors' training regime, and particularly this particular issue? Do you think there's a chance for us to put more into that mandatory bag of training for local authority councillors in return for this salary uplift, should it be awarded?
Sure. So yes, I assisted the Scottish Local Authorities Remuneration Committee with their work, because you know they came to our office just to ask about conduct and whether that, alongside obviously the level of remuneration, represented a barrier to people entering into political life. So yeah, we were able to assist them to an extent with the research that they were undertaking. I think they came up with some very excellent recommendations, and my understanding is that the Scottish ministers have accepted those, and I anticipate there is going to be an implementation date from January next year, as I understand it. So from my perspective, that's all positive news. In answer to the second part of your question, I think anything that we can do collectively to drive up standards in public life can only be a good thing. I mentioned there that some of the conduct does, I think, inevitably represent a barrier to more diversity in public life, and that's not a good thing. So anything we can do to improve diversity, and if that means improving conduct at local government level, is to be encouraged.
Okay, many thanks for that, Ian. Much appreciated. Back to you, convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Willie. I'm now going to bring in Megan Gallagher.
Thank you very much, convener. Good morning. So my first question's on waiting times, because the annual report outlines that waiting times have reduced in 22 and 23, and that of course is welcome. But it's just to find out, how long are waiting times currently from its beginning to end, and what has been done to further reduce the length of time it takes to conclude a complaint?
Yes, so this is something we monitor on a very regular basis, so that we have a senior management team within the office, and statistical information has to come to it on a monthly basis from the team that handles complaints. So for this year, for last year, the average for admissibility, the first stage was 4.6 months. At this point in time, it's 4.9, so that's average to reach a decision on whether or not a complaint should go forward to investigation. Investigation times have come down this year, which is a very good thing, but we feel that we do need to to be doing more on basically that initial waiting time. You'll know that complaint volumes increased, and that pattern hasn't changed in the current financial year. We're relatively close to where we were this time last year. So clearly, we've got a limited resource and we need to dedicate it to whatever we feel our stakeholders find most important. Clearly, you don't want an investigation to last particularly long, but clearly, you don't have to wait to get an initial decision from us either. So we've introduced a couple of new measures. One was so they're both being piloted, but one for the last 5 months has been running. It's called the Complaints Allocation Plan. So it's a much more formal way of triaging complaints, basically. So what we're doing now is giving every complaint a red, amber, or a RAG rating, red, amber, or green rating, and allocating those to the team of investigating officers, so that they've all got a fair and balanced case mix and a proper understanding of how quickly they need to get through each stage of each case that they have. Their line manager discusses that with them every week, just to ensure that that they're making good progress on that, and that seems to be working very well. We'll assess the effectiveness of that pilot at the start of the new year, but all things being equal, and if the staff feel it's working well for them as well, then that's likely something that we'll maintain. The second thing that we've just introduced, because we do feel, based on the figures, that we need to bring down waiting times, but what that means is dedicating more resource to that end of the process. So it may have a knock-on effect for investigation times, which might go up a wee bit, but it's a balancing act for us. But we've introduced this new duty IO role, which rotates around the entire team. What they are going to be required to do, and it's just started this week actually, following a fair bit of consultation with the staff, because if we don't get buy-in from them, it's not going to work particularly well. We always take their input. But what happens there is it's immediate triage. So any new complaints that came in the last week, they're immediately triaged, because that tended to be happening on a monthly basis. We identify complaints where we need further information, and we go out and contact complainers at that point in time immediately, so the evidence is still fresh, and say we need this additional information, or we need you to properly articulate this complaint because we couldn't put this to our respondent at this point in time, but also to identify the ones that are out of scope, so those can be dismissed immediately. And clearly that will bring down the average waiting times overall, because the quick dismissals, the way that's happening is they're allocated on a cab rank basis to the entire team, and then their role is to basically get back to the complainer and say this one isn't admissible. So that should bring down the overall waiting times. And we'll continue to monitor the situation. We know this is an issue, and it's an area that we definitely want to improve on.
Thank you. And just a brief follow-up to that, do you think there's a risk with the influx of social media-related complaints and the number of, as we've just heard from Willie Coffey, counsellor on counsellor crime, of complaints, do you think there is a risk that there might be a time where waiting times for complaints could increase again, just purely for that reason, despite all of these good incentives that you're putting in place?
They could, which is why I think it's incumbent on us to constantly look at ways in which we can improve our own performance. I recently attended some global government forum training on improving productivity in the public sector, because that's the only place that we can go, really. I certainly feel that we've got sufficient resources to deal with what's in front of us, but that has to be a factor, which is we do need to improve on productivity. I think it might also be worth just reminding the committee that a large proportion of this team is relatively new. So over time, we are, all of us collectively, and I include myself in that in respect of the complaint handling function of the office, all of us over time are getting better at what we do, and that will increasingly be the case. So between those two things, I think we can handle increases as well and manage those. That's certainly our intention.
Thank you. And then on to my final question. Back to the annual report states that 2 of the 3 directions issued by the Standards Commission for Scotland have now expired or they've been rescinded. And the remaining direction relates to reporting on all investigations and the outcomes to those. But that's got an expiry date of the 31st of January 2025. So how confident are you that this outstanding direction will expire as planned, or do you think there's a risk that it might not?
I don't view it as a risk, to be honest with you. So when I did my workforce planning previously, it was predicated on a few assumptions, that complaint volumes and complexity would stay relatively steady, but, clearly they are rising a bit. But the other one was that, the directions would remain in place. The 2 that have lapsed or have been rescinded, the Commission was, and clearly the convener and executive director will be able to talk to this because it was their decision. But my understanding is that they were happy to remove them because we wrote them onto the face of our manual or procedures. We operate as though they kind of were in place, and it would certainly be my intention to continue to report to the Standards Commission in future whether or not that outcome direction remained in place in January. So if they are assured by my statement in public to that effect, I anticipate probably it will be lifted, but to my mind it doesn't matter either way.
That's great. No, thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Megan. And I'm now going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Good morning, sir. Good to see you again. Delighted to see that there is strong financial management is talked about for the organisation, but within that there are cost implications and cost increases. And for sort of 23-24, we're now looking at 1.5 million as a sort of expenditure in comparison with 1.04 in the past. So that is quite an increase of over 50% over the year, and that has a significant increase. We know that your workload has increased and you require to get rid of the backlog, as we discussed in previous committees I've sat on with you. But could you explain the reasons behind the cost rise and provide assurances that that increase is once again value for money for the taxpayer? Yes,
of course. To paraphrase it, it's best for me not to mark my own homework, but as I've indicated, the auditors are happy that we are delivering best value, and that was with that budgetary increase. But probably important, just without wishing necessarily to dwell on the past, but you have the papers before you and you know what the office's circumstances were like. Going back to the recommendations of our prior auditors, Deloitte's, they'd identified that we had some significant issues in the office. So just to remind members, the entire investigations team under my immediate predecessor left. The new staff that my immediate predecessor, a proportion of those left as well. That's what I inherited. Staff turnover over that 2-year tenure sat at, and this is headcount, 133%. So our budget was predicated on the number of staff that we actually had in the office at the time. So clearly it was low because we were carrying a number of vacancies. Our auditor said, as a matter of urgency, one of their very urgent recommendations, you need to fill your vacancies. So I did that as a matter of urgency as soon as I took up the acting commissioner post. But one of their other key recommendations was you need to do some workforce planning because we do not think that you've got the resources that you need to fulfil your statutory functions. So I conducted, at the same time as I was looking to recruit new people, I conducted that workforce planning exercise. It was really comprehensive. And on the back of that, I had to produce a really compelling business case for consideration by the SPCB. So the workforce planning exercise was completed in May 2022. The business case was submitted to the SPCB at that time. The earliest opportunity for me to discuss it with them, and that was in person. And believe me, it was a very robust discussion in front of all the members of the SPCB. to justify the additional resources that I felt the office needed. And it was a very comprehensive business case. Yes, it related to investigations, but it also related to corporate services because the auditors had identified that we had issues with governance. I was the acting commissioner, which meant that we had a vacancy, a live vacancy in the public appointments side of the office, which needed to be filled as well because we'd been carrying that, and we got some admin support. So it amounted to, it was 7.6 full-time equivalent staff altogether. The SPCB agreed that we absolutely did need those resources, so the business case was approved. We went on to recruit from, let me see, would have been December of 2022, filled the posts May 2023, and the knock-on, so it's quite a complex explanation, but the knock-on effect of that was that's where the increase in the budget comes from. And it might be helpful just to highlight that 80% of my budget is staffing costs. We spend very little money on anything else, and so inevitably, because of that increase in resources, the budget went up.
And you've touched on the public appointments section, and that once again needed beefing up, and you've put in an additional 3 full-time members of staff into that section to support. And maybe it'd be good to get a flavour of why that took place and the additional impact that they're now going to have.
Sure.
And how that tackled your work-life balance type process within the organisation, because as you've identified, it was struggling to cope with its day-to-day runnings, but at the same time it needed to have some impact. So a flavour of that would be useful too.
Yeah, by all means. So actually, we've not increased the complement in public appointments that much. So we were carrying a vacancy because I was the acting commissioner and I had previously been head of public appointments. So that post had to be filled. We had, so I was at grade 5 and a grade 4. So we filled the grade 4 post because the person who was acting up for me ended up filling the grade 5 post. So all that we've gotten additionally in there is admin support. So one admin support person to support the work of the public appointments team. As part of our bid, we had looked for another public appointments officer. Because clearly we had a backlog in respect of public appointments as well. We were so under-resourced there. But we had plans, and you will know this from your work on the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. We needed to refresh the Diversity Deliver strategy, which hadn't been looked at since 2008. And that's with a view to improving board diversity, which we think is vital work. It's been happening incrementally, but we think more progress needs to be made there. So we had sought to fill a post on a permanent basis to take that work forward. In discussions with that team, I've concluded that we could actually surrender that post and get a contractor in to help us with it for a 2-year period as well. Because the SPCB have said to all office holders, if you can make savings, please do. And we found a way of doing that by relinquishing that particular post. So in terms of public appointments, there hasn't been a great increase in resourcing. And the work that we've been able to take forward because of that, so surveying applicants had lapsed, surveying board chairs on the effectiveness that their new people are coming on board, are making when they come on board. That's been resurrected. We're producing good practice guidance for panels again. We're doing more training. We're doing more outreach activity. So all of these things, which I think are probably more than just nice to haves, have been resurrected and are making a difference to the appointment system.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'm now going to bring in Mark Griffin, who's joining us online.
Thank you, Camilla. Good morning. The annual report states that you were required to examine the appointment practices of one board during the year, and that resulted in a report of non-compliance with the code being made to the Scottish Parliament. Now, I'm just wondering if you want to explain a bit more about this, since this was the first, I think, since 2011. If you could give us a bit more detail about that particular instance.
Yes, be very happy to. And I've got to say, funnily enough, perhaps not. That's not the appropriate expression to use, but it was in relation to appointments to the Scottish Local Authorities Remuneration Committee itself. Now, it's not the panel, the selection panel, that makes decisions on whom to appoint and whom not to appoint, and it's not the selection panel who makes decisions about the criteria for selection for particular positions that have to be filled. Those decisions rest with the Scottish ministers. The Scottish ministers put together a selection panel, and depending on a number of factors, I decide whether or not to appoint a representative from my office to sit in as a member of the panel for that entire recruitment process. In this particular case, they went out looking for people who had knowledge and experience that was going to be relevant to the work of the SLARC, for obvious reasons. And again, given the nature of the work that they were doing, they were looking for people who had experience of serving as local authority councillors. A local authority councillor applied in good faith for one of those roles, went through the entire process, and the panel found that individual suitable for appointment, so one of the most able people. At the far end of the process, there was effectively a change in policy position, which was that if you're a serving councillor, you have a conflict of interest, and you cannot basically serve as a member on this particular board. Now, if that decision had been made by the Scottish ministers at the outset of the process and included in the pack and said, you're disqualified, then I'd have had no issue with that whatsoever, because that's the prerogative of the Scottish ministers. But the fact is that that wasn't done. Somebody went through that entire process in good faith and was considered to be the most able person for that role. And then, right at the end of that process, they were disqualified. Now, to my mind, and in the eyes of the Code of Practice, which I publish and which officials are meant to follow, that was fundamentally unfair to that individual. And that's why I concluded that the code had been breached in a material regard. But as you've observed yourself, you know, these instances are relatively rare. Officials do work very hard to comply with the code, and I certainly see the role of my office to support them in doing so.
Okay, thanks for that. That's a really helpful expansion on that detail. Thanks for giving us that update. The other area I wanted to touch on was the survey that you talked about last year that you were planning out to roll out to complainers and respondents. The annual report said that because the return rate was so low, you found it difficult to, give a robust analysis of the findings. I just wonder whether you're planning to continue with that survey and if you had any plans on trying to boost the return rate.
Yeah, those are really good questions, and actually it's one of the things that I've found most disappointing. So again, it's something that we're monitoring, but return rates this year have been really, really low as well. And it's very, very disappointing. So I am discussing with the senior management team what we can do to improve them. And I'm really not sure why the rate is so low. We've been running similar surveys in public appointments for a good many years, apart from the hiatus that I just described to your colleague. And response rates there are about 30%. It is nothing like that. At the moment we're looking at 1% in the current financial year return rate, which clearly isn't good enough. So we need to find ways of improving it. The reason I find it so disappointing is we get an awful lot of feedback from both respondents and complainers direct to our office and to the investigating officer. Some very recently at a hearing in person, I got really positive feedback from a respondent about the way in which we had handled their case. So we need to try and find a way of translating that into getting people to fill out the survey. Some of the options we're considering, so at the moment it's in the closure letters. There's a link to it in the closure letters that we send people. We're thinking we might try some of the things that commercial organisations try, so putting a wee button into the email that's sent to them and, you know, just giving them an opportunity to link through to it in that way. The other option potentially is just to gather up some of the feedback that we're getting from people in emails and other correspondence, and including that in the annual report. If it helps provide assurance, I mean, maybe no news is good news, but we also track formal complaints about us. So everyone is entitled to make a formal complaint about us as an office alongside the other complaints that they can make. In the last financial year, we had 2 of those, and in this financial year, we had 2 of those. And in all 4 cases, there was really not much in terms of substance. So by and large, I think people are happy with the way in which we treat them. But I do understand that we should do more. And the other reason for that is the surveys themselves gather demographic data, and that's of real interest to me, which is, you know, whether or not women who come into contact with us or people from a minority ethnic background who come into contact with us feel that we're treating them differently. But based on the return rates at the moment, we just can't draw any conclusions.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm going to come back briefly to Alexander Stewart.
Thank you. We've touched already on this morning about councillor and councillor complaints between one another. And we know that that's about 17% of the process. But we, in the work that the committee has been doing, have been looking at barriers to elected office. And we've heard that women councillors, female councillors, face much more hostility and much more toxicity within sometimes the council environment and the group. So it would be good to get a flavour if female councillors are submitting more complaints than male councillors within that process. Is that a trend that you've seen, or is there some areas that you wish to express on that?
That's a very good question. I've said to the committee previously that we definitely plan to do research in this area, so I think potentially that's something that we could relatively quickly do, and I'll take a note to look at that and come back to you on it, because I think it's a very good question. My particular quandary at the moment is, and as I explained to your colleague earlier, far and away the majority of our resource genuinely has to be dedicated to complaint handling and bringing down waiting times. I think that's important to people. And once we have done that, I think it gives us sufficient spare capacity to do the sort of research that I genuinely want to do. But I think on gender split, that's something that would be relatively straightforward for us to look at. My feeling, my impression is yes. And certainly anecdotally, I think there's a feeling out there from new young female councillors in particular that they are entering into a misogynistic environment. Whether or not they're all complaining about that is a different matter as well. Some of this conduct can be quite low level, and I've heard that people feel perhaps reticent about complaining. Relatively recently, I attended a monitoring officers workshop that was set up by the Standards Commission, and the views of monitoring officers, I think, in particular, are relevant, and perhaps that's something that the committee might wish to pursue via SOLAR, just to get their impression of what's going on the ground. But I suppose the point that I need to come back to is, even if it feels like relatively low-level conduct, that sort of thing can and will wear you down over time. And we can, as an office, as can the Standards Commission, following a referral, look at a course of conduct. So if people are feeling, there's a lot of this low-level stuff going on and it's undermining me, they should continue to keep a note of those things to form the basis of a course of conduct complaint, which we genuinely can look at. But yes, there's a level of toxicity sometimes. There are behaviours which I see that I feel are inappropriate, and these are definitely barriers. I referred the committee previously to research in this area, and I know that recommendations have now come out from the Local Government Association following that research. I think most recently in May they produced a toolkit for councils to assess themselves how well they think they're doing. It was the Debate Not Hate research, members may recall. So they're continuing to do work in this area, as is the Improvement Service. And I should highlight also, I recently was interviewed by Talat Yaqub for Elector. Are familiar, well, members will be, I know from other research that you're doing in this area, familiar with the work of Elector. They are currently conducting research into this in particular, which is whether or not there are barriers for women entering political life. And also, interestingly, this time they are taking an intersectional approach. So it's not just, whether or not you're female, but, if you have disabilities, a minority ethnic background, etc. So they're taking this intersectional approach to the research. I've said to Talat that the committee's definitely going to be interested in the recommendations that come out of this. And the findings. So she has undertaken to be in touch with the committee once that research has been completed. But I think we all recognise that it's an issue. I think the other thing I'd like to touch on today, because I saw that the committee did write to all the political parties, and one of the questions it asked was, is toxicity in terms of the debate having an impact on people's willingness to come forward, having an impact on people's willingness to stay in public life? It's patchy from what I could see. So that's across the political parties, the extent to which they police their own codes of conduct. It's also patchy from council area to council area. And my particular concern is the lack of support for people who feel that, they aren't being supported, that they are exposed. And that in some cases they're finding it very, very difficult to fulfil their role because all they are doing is trying to do their best for their constituents, and they're being subjected to conduct that they should not be subjected to.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexander. I'm going to bring in Emma Roddick with a supplementary, and then if you just want to go on to your next question as well, that'd be great.
Great, thank you, Convener. Really good as a former female councillor to hear the willingness to look into whether women are making more complaints. I wonder if that work could also cover whether women are more often complained about, including those complaints which aren't found to have any application from the code.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. So the Commissioner and the Standards Commission have written to the Scottish Government asking for changes to legislation, and one of the requests was for the inclusion of explicit powers for the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body to remove or replace an incumbent SCS member or the Ethical Standards Commissioner in the event of a serious performance, conduct or attendance issue. I wonder if you could discuss why this request has come forward now.
Sure. Well, again, without necessarily wishing to dwell on the past, I think it's important that in the event that a commissioner, so either myself or a member of the commission is operating ineffectively, everyone understands that there's a mechanism in place for removal, because I would expect guidance to accompany this, and something can be done about it quickly, to be honest with you. Because it benefits no one if someone remains in post because there's a lack of understanding about what the mechanism is and how one might move quickly in order to ensure that that the individual involved no longer fulfills the role that they are fulfilling. Fundamentally, to an extent, we are, myself and the Standards Commission, we're kind of guardians of the ethical standards framework. It's terribly undermining, I would suggest, to have someone in that particular post who doesn't exemplify the values that are anticipated from people operating in public life. So quite important.
Great. Thanks very much. That brings us to the end of our questions, and we very much appreciate you coming and joining us this morning and giving us the time to just ask a few more details on the report and the work that you're doing. I think it's been great to hear some of the improvements, innovation that you've been doing over the time that you've been in post. So very much appreciate that, and it's great to hear that you've got a full a raft of people all busy working through this process. And I really like the innovation you talked about in terms of the RAG and the triaging and getting more quickly back to complaints to understand whether they're inadmissible or admissible. I think that's really important. That whole thing of keeping people waiting, let's remove that from kind of the experience of people in Scotland. I think that's great that you're doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Convener and members. Appreciate the opportunity again. Thank you.
Great. And now I'll briefly suspend to allow for a changeover of witnesses. We're now going to turn to agenda item 3, which is to take evidence on the annual report of the Standards Commission for Scotland for 2023 to 2024. And we're joined for this item by Lorna Johnson, who's the Executive Director at the Standards Commission for Scotland, and Suzanne Vestry, who is convener at the Standards Commission for Scotland. And so just a little bit of housekeeping. So we'll direct the questions initially in the first instance to Lorna, but please feel free, Suzanne, if you want to contribute. And there's no need to turn on your microphones. We'll do that for you. One less thing to think about. And I'd now like to invite Ms. Vestry to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much for inviting us here today. My name's Suzanne Vestry, and I'm the convener of the Standards Commission. I've been a member of the Commission since February 2022 and was appointed convener from May 2024. For the benefit particularly of members who might be new to the committee, I have a short opening statement. The role of the Standards Commission is to encourage high ethical standards in public life, including the promotion through a wide range of means and enforcement of the relative codes of conduct, and to issue guidance on how the code should be interpreted to councils and to devolved public bodies. And the Commission is also responsible for adjudicating on alleged breaches of the codes and, where a breach is found, to apply a sanction. Following the conclusion of any investigation he has undertaken into an alleged breach of the applicable code by a councillor or member of a devolved public body, the Ethical Standards Commissioner sends a report to the Standards Commission outlining his findings and his conclusions. The Standards Commission must consider his findings and then independently decide whether to hold a hearing, direct the Commissioner to carry out further investigations, or do neither, which essentially means that no further action will be taken on that complaint. We aim to make these decisions within 5 working days of receiving them from the Ethical Standards Commissioner. The Commission will decide to take no action if it does not consider it's in the public interest or proportionate to hold a hearing. Hearings are conducted by a panel comprising of 3 Commission members, and hearings are held usually in public to determine whether the councillor or member concerned has breached their respective code. If a breach is found, then the panel is obliged to impose a sanction, which can either be a censure, suspension or disqualification. The Commission has 5 part-time members appointed by the Parliamentary Corporation with the agreement of the Parliament. As convener, I'm contracted to work the equivalent of 3 days a month, while the remaining members work 2 days a month. Members also sit on hearing panels as and when required. In the year 2023-24, the Standards Commission received 50 referrals from the Ethical Standards Commissioner and held hearings into 16 of these. We aim to hold our hearings within 6 to 12 weeks from making the decision to hold a hearing. The Standards Commission has 1 full-time member of staff, Lorna. As the Executive Director, she is the accountable officer. Lorna is assisted by a case manager, an office manager, and an administrative assistant, all of whom are part-time, with the overall staffing complement being equivalent to 3.1 full-time members of staff. As you'll see from our annual report, we have a small staff team and budget, but get through a large volume of work. I hope this has been a helpful introduction and summary of the Commission's remit. We very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss our work and are happy to answer any questions that the committee may have on the Commission or any general issues concerning the ethical standards framework. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think that was really useful, actually, to hear the detail of the process and how you pick up the work from the Ethical Standards Commissioner and process that. Lorna, I've got a kind of broad question around the fact that the Standards Commission annual report states that the organisation has had a positive impact on ethical standards in public life. And I'd be interested if you could tell us specifically what has occurred for the Standards Commission to be able to state that.
Yeah, of course. I think the main thing that we do in terms of the positive impact is the training and promotional work. We go out and we do training events for members of devolved public bodies and councillors. We ran a number of events last year. We also do that through our guidance and advice notes. When we get intelligence through inquiries or cases that are referred to us, we can kind of see the types of issues that arise, whether it's maybe confidentiality or respect or social media, and we can create guidance, we can create e-learning. We held a couple of seminars, joint webinars last year with the improvement service that were really targeted at some of those. We did one on social media, we did one on assisting constituents, we've done one recently on confidentiality, because those were three types of areas that we knew we were seeing a rise in complaints concerning those areas. We also, in terms of our impact, we have KPIs in place, we have service standards in place, but we also we get a sense of our impact from the inquiries, from the number of inquiries that we receive and that we're able to help people with, so kind of help prevent breaches of the codes from occurring, which is again what we try to do with our training events. And I think one of the things that kind of shows that impact is the reduction in what I would kind of describe as more inadvertent breaches of the codes, and that's the kind of thing where it's less of a behaviour type of one, where it's maybe a failure to register an interest within the time that's allowed, or someone's not declared an interest that actually probably is a declarable interest, but they've thought about it, they've decided not to. We would maybe interpret the provisions in the code differently, but it's not been a kind of deliberate attempt to conceal the interest. And so the types of cases that the Ethical Standards Commissioner is receiving do tend to be far more ones where it's much more of a behaviour issue, that maybe somebody's just not thought about something, or they've posted something on social media, that they've perhaps not really thought through, or they've been angry, or they're responding to something. So I think it's definitely more those types of cases, and I think that is a lot to do with the work that we do to raise awareness of the codes, and also how to interpret the provisions.
Can I just ask, just kind of curious around the training, because it's great that you make all that provision. Do you have quite a good level of attendance?
Yeah, we do. We also, I should have said, we have standard training presentations and videos on the website that councils can use for training councillors. So it's not a case that we necessarily have to go out, but when we do go out, this year so far we've been to 2 councils, Perth and Kinross in South Ayrshire, and we had really good attendance at both those events. We get really good attendance when we do training for boards of public bodies as well. And I was quite interested to hear the Ethical Standards Commissioner's response to the questions about mandatory training, because I think most councils do provide training on the code around about the time of the election and when councillors first come into post. Whereas with boards of public bodies, we get training requests almost on a continual basis, because their members, they have a turnover of members. I think with the mandatory training, my slight concern about that for councillors would be that they get so much information straight after the election. I think it's really difficult, and it's on such a kind of wide variety of subjects, and sometimes really quite technical things if they're going to be on a planning or a licensing committee. I think it's quite a lot of information that they have to take in, and so I'm not convinced that mandatory training is necessarily, or certainly mandatory training at that stage is appropriate. But I think refresher training and having that training available that they can access it at any time. The other thing about training is that the code it covers a lot. There's 7 sections to the councillor's code. It's really quite wide-ranging, and so we've tried to break down some of our guidance and advice and training material, our e-learning modules, for example, on specific topics that councillors can kind of dip in and out of. So if, for example, they're concerned about whether they have to declare an interest or not, they can just access quite a small part of the code at that particular time, and that might assist them.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to bring in Emma Roddick briefly on a supplementary, I think, around the mandatory training piece.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up there. You said councillors get quite a lot of information when they begin. Are you picking up that that's consistent in all places? Because it certainly hasn't been my experience. I think some places, and particularly if you come in during a by-election, it's possible you're just handed the code and the standing orders and that's about it.
Yeah, my understanding was that after the election, after the main election, pretty much all councils offer that training and provide that training. I'm not sure about the by-elections, but like I say, we do have that. We have training videos available on our website on the code that they could access, and all council monitoring officers are aware of that, so they should really be telling their councillors. But that's something I can pick up with monitoring officers.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'm just on the mandatory training process. I totally hear you and what you're saying around information overload. I certainly experienced that when I first started in this role as an MSP in general. But maybe there's something that could be a drip-fed process over time that makes sure that over a number of months they do it, and the sections that are relevant or needed come forward, because information all at once is not useful because it just doesn't go in necessarily.
Yeah, and I think also it's the code, we try to put in our guidance on the code, we put in scenarios and case examples, because it's one thing to read information that's, before you're to hear the information, but you really need to apply it to the situations that you might find yourself in. And I think that comes with experience as well. So it's a case of, on day one, if you're getting an overload of information about scenarios that you've never actually been in, it's maybe harder to take it in than it would be to have training, a bit further down the line, or refresher training.
Yeah, great, thanks. So last year, when you joined us, you told us that it's hard to know whether standards of behaviour are deteriorating or if the public are just more aware that they can complain. And I think we'd be interested to understand if the Commission has been able to do any research over the past year that would provide further insight into this.
Yeah, unfortunately, the answer is no. It's a capacity issue. We've not managed to do any research. We do get a lot of information, though, either from the complaints that are referred to us. We get a lot from the inquiries that we receive from councillors, from officers, from members of the public, from going out and doing our training events. And I think we hold I think the Ethical Standards Commissioner mentioned it, we hold a workshop with monitoring officers once a year and one with standards officers of public bodies once a year. And so we tend to always ask them at that what their experiences are. And I think it is a mixed bag. I think minority administrations has an impact, whether it's a minority administration has an impact sometimes in terms of behaviours, because I think if it's a minority administration, perhaps colleagues are less inclined to call out behaviours because, votes are needed or whatever it is. We do hear anecdotally that the issues are not necessarily between parties. It can be within the same party that there can be issues. So I think it is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of behaviours. But the one thing I would say is that the number of complaints being received is not necessarily the only indicator of behaviours, because as the Ethical Standards Commissioner pointed out, some of those are simply not admissible. Quite a large percentage of those are not admissible. But in terms of, I think an indicator is far more how many breach findings are being made, and the committee may be reassured to know that they're fairly consistent. We're not seeing increases necessarily, huge increases in the number of breach findings.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you. Good morning. You've talked about in the report that you had 16 hearings during that duration, and the costs for the annual were about 337,000. So if you equate that to the 16, that would roughly see on average it would be about £21,000 per hearing. Now, is that the case that each hearing costs as much as that, or are some hearings more lengthy or take some time, or are they all around the same sort of structure and physique as to what happens? Yeah. And do you what value do you put on that process, and how do you equate and look at that as a guide to ensuring that you're spending the money that you'd use in the way that's proposed and gives the organisation and the people doing the hearing the best value for money from that process?
Yeah, I mean, just to say at the outset, that 338 is our budget. That's the overall budget. That's not the cost per hearing by any stretch of the imagination. That is our our overall budget. So our cost per hearing for last year, I think it was in the region of £1,800 per hearing. You know, a lot of our costs are, I think it was last year, 89% of our costs were, staff and member cost, which the members' costs do involve their time at hearing, so that does take account of that time. But yeah, the cost per hearing was 1,800 was the average cost per hearing. We, in terms of getting value for money for those hearing costs, we undertake a review after every single hearing. Standards Commission members undertake a review of that hearing at the next meeting they have after the hearing to discuss how it went in terms of both the decision making but also how efficiently the hearing was conducted. We have a range of measures in place. We hold pre-hearing meetings before each hearing to try and resolve any kind of procedural issues, to make sure that the parties are aware of what the panel will think is going to be relevant evidence, so that they're not trying to introduce stuff that's completely irrelevant. We also do an annual review of the hearings at the end of each year to kind of, and we make improvements all the time in terms of how we conduct hearings.
I think if we're able to hold a hearing online, for example, if there are no witnesses, say, then if we can hold a hearing online, then we'll do that.
Okay.
And that obviously cuts down time and money for everybody. But we're always very conscious that justice kind of needs to be seen to be done, and that people who've complained or people who have an interest need to be able to attend and see that happen.
Yeah, we actually did a review recently of online hearings against in-person hearings, and we did some research in terms of the kind of the advantages and disadvantages. And as Susie said, the online hearings can be very useful and a really good tool in cases where there's no kind of real dispute about the factual basis.
Yes.
And there's no, maybe even the respondent accepts that they've breached the code. But you still do always have a risk of technical difficulties if you've got lots of witnesses. Someone's Wi-Fi not working can really throw the hearing and make it quite inefficient. We also think there's perhaps a bit of an issue about gravitas with online hearings, people not maybe taking it quite seriously. And as Susie said, it's the going out and being seen to be, because we hold our hearings in the locality where the respondent is based. And so members of the public from that area can go along and watch in local press. And they do. So,
and I think it's important that opportunity is there for individuals. And as you say, if there is a wider community that wants to be involved in that process, whether it be from their own community or from the media community or whatever one that makes it take place, that is important to have that dimension within the process as well, so that everyone gets the chance to have the opportunity. So how many hearings would you have that would be online?
I think of the 16 last year, 5 were online.
5. Okay.
Yeah. But the decision to hold it online is very much based on whether there's a dispute about the facts and how many witnesses. It's not based on any issues about costs in terms of, if it's going to be in Orkney or the Borders or, somewhere further away. It's not based on that. We give a lot of information to local journalists before hearings. We publish that we're holding the hearing, and we go out and we try and engage with local journalists to try and get a bit more kind of coverage of the code. So again, I don't know whether that maybe then also contributes, just awareness of the whole system. I don't know whether that contributes to a rise in complaints as well, the fact that we're doing a bit more media engagement. But we think that's important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. And speaking of online, we have the opportunity in our committee to have members join us online. And we're now going to go to questions from Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much again, Convener, and good morning to Lorna and Suzanne. Lorna, I was hoping to just ask you to say a bit more about potential emerging trends in the complaints process. I think Ian earlier had talked about social media perhaps being one area that we're seeing a rise, and the nature of complaints being more personal complaints about, councillors from one to the other, personal attacks and so on and so forth. Could you maybe expand a wee bit on that for the committee, please, and what you're seeing perhaps as emerging trends in the whole complaints process or the complaints domain, please?
Yeah, of course. We don't see the complaints that are rejected by the Commissioner as inadmissible. So the ones that we see are the ones that he has undertaken an investigation on. And as he said, social media, we're seeing some behaviour towards officers, towards council officers. My kind of understanding is that some of that is driven by some of the issues that we were talking about earlier, especially the budget kind of constraints, and maybe councillors being seen to distance themselves from trying to distance themselves from difficult decisions, perhaps. We've seen a couple of cases in the past year on breach of confidentiality, and again, those tend to be, I think, linked to difficult decisions that the council is having to make because of budgetary constraints. I think we are seeing a few on declarations, but not as many, where someone's failed to declare an interest. But yeah, it tends to be more the kind of respect, bullying and harassment type of complaints that we're seeing at the moment.
Are you seeing a regular kind of increase in these areas that should give us any concerns? And of course, then turning from that to the training element and whether we make it mandatory. I'll come back to you on that in a moment. But are you seeing rising trends in some of these particular issues emerging?
I think we're seeing more in terms of respect. That's gradually over maybe the past 5 years. We are seeing more issues in terms of the kind of respect type complaints, and within that, I would say that's behaviour towards members of the public, colleagues, officers. Perhaps getting a bit involved in operational management of the council. So yes, we're seeing more of those. What we try to do with our training is we do try and kind of target sort of training at those areas. The webinars that we're doing with the improvement service, we did the two that we did last year were very much targeted. We did one on assisting constituents, which was trying to explain about how you can best go about assisting your constituents without getting involved inappropriately in operational matters and with still being respectful towards officers. We did one on social media, which again, the improvement service kind of led the side of it. This is how best to do things, and we covered the kind of, and this is what you could fall foul of, and this is what you should avoid type of thing. And those webinars were really well attended, and we got really good engagement with the councillors who did attend them.
Okay, and turning to training and whether aspects should be mandatory or not, could you just clarify, Lorna, is training on the councillor's code of conduct, is that a mandatory element for a local authority councillor, or is it an optional element that they can choose not to participate in?
The adherence to the code is mandatory. So when they sign their
training in it, I mean,
yeah.
I don't mean adherence to the code, but training on its purposes.
No, it's not. I think my understanding is when councils offer that training at the outset, they make it quite often. They make it sound like it's mandatory, and they really, really push and encourage councillors to come along. I think my understanding is most new councillors do attend that, and that there isn't huge difficulties with, with people refusing to attend. It can sometimes be that more experienced councillors don't go to refresher training because they think, they know it and they think they don't need it. So I think that tends to be more of an issue. But certainly when we hold hearings, we have a policy on the application of sanctions, which talks about the kind of factors that we'll take into account, aggravating and mitigating factors that we would take into account if we find a breach of the code at a hearing. And one of the aggravating factors in that would be if training was offered and not taken up. Training on the code was offered and not taken.
That's really interesting. You'll be aware of the committee's support for the Local Authorities Remuneration Committee on councillor salaries and stuff. Is there an opportunity here, Lorna, to, if that goes ahead, to introduce some of these training elements and make them mandatory? And I know you said in your remarks we don't want to burden a newly elected councillor either just coming in the door or at a by-election with a whole host of training requirements, but if that could be a managed process during the first year of their being elected, for example, but they're being mandatory components in there. Is that something that we should perhaps look at and try to embed some of this training into local authorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't have any issue with that. I think that's a good idea. But I think, as the Ethical Standards Commissioner alluded to earlier, it's not necessarily making people go along, it's making that training as compelling and interesting, and making sure that the buy-in is, I think, the more important bit, because, you know, as he said, you can click a button saying, yes, I watched that, or I went along, but are you concentrating? Are you focused on it? Is it interesting enough? And that's why we try to make our guidance and our advice notes, we try to have those case examples in it. And when we go out and do our training events, we try and give scenarios, and we ask councillors to break into smaller groups to discuss those scenarios and go, well, you know, in this scenario, would it be a breach? And if this factor was different, you know, what would you do in this situation, kind of thing, to really get them to kind of really think about the provisions and how to apply them to themselves and the situations they might find themselves in. And I think the committee will recall when the codes were revised towards the end of 2021, one of the main differences with the councillors' code and the model code of conduct was that they were put into the first person, and again that was to try and create more engagement, so that, you know, instead of being this written document, you know, you must do this, you must, you know, mustn't do that, whatever, it was much, I will do this and I understand this. And yeah, and I certainly think, and the feedback that we've got is that the revised code is much easier to understand.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you for that, Lorna. Thank you, convener.
Thanks, Willie. Suzanne, I think you indicated you wanted to come in earlier, but I missed.
It was about the trends in hearings, and Lorna had mentioned that behaviour towards officers was an issue, and I think last year at the committee meeting there was a question about councillors feeling that they were not able to scrutinise effectively, and we've taken that on board and gone away and briefed on that specifically, because I think councillors were struggling to, or some councillors were struggling to know how to scrutinise, but to do it without being challenging and disrespectful. And I think, you know, we've tried to work with councils to enable councillors to challenge and scrutinise more effectively.
Yeah, and I think tied into that was the right of access to information, and how they go about making sure that they've got the right information to be able to do their role, but that they're not asking for so much detail that they're then becoming involved in operational matters. So yeah, so that was one of the reasons that we created that joint advice note with the Improvement Service on the right of access to information.
I think for me, breaches of confidentiality, Lorna flagged up, and that is a concern, because the breaches of confidentiality where we've held hearings have not always been inadvertent breaches of confidentiality. Sometimes they've been deliberate. And again, that goes back to the point that both Lorna and the Ethical Standards Commissioner made about councils having to make really difficult decisions about service provision. So if that was to continue, that kind of deliberate breaching of confidentiality, then that is something we would be really concerned about.
Okay, great. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher, the question.
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning both. I'm looking at a table just now from the annual report, and it's Exhibit 8, and it's the details of reports referred to SES in 23-24 and an outcome. And within the table itself, it shows that there's 4 cases that were referred to the Commission, where the Commissioner had assessed that a breach had taken place, but then there was no further action taken by the Standards Commission. So I'm wondering if you'd be able to talk us through certain scenarios that would lead to that outcome, and if there's any trend in that in terms of what those particular cases could be.
Yeah, I looked up those 4 cases before the committee, and just one thing to point out at the beginning is when we are deciding whether or not to hold a hearing, the threshold is whether it's proportionate and in the public interest. It's not whether there's been a breach or not, because obviously that's something that would be looked at a hearing. So I think in 2 of the cases it was considered it wasn't proportionate because they were registration of interest cases where the person had registered the interest, they'd just been a bit late in doing it, and they'd apologised and they'd put it on the register. So it was considered it wasn't in the public interest and proportionate to hold the hearing. In the other two cases, it was that we essentially disagreed with the Ethical Standards Commissioner's conclusions, and one that the code even applied, and the second one was on how he'd interpreted a provision about the registering of election expenses.
In terms of disagreements, in terms of outcomes, is that something that comes up often, or is it very rare? Because there's only 4 cases here, and of course 2 of them were for other reasons, so I take it that's a rare occurrence.
No, not necessarily. At hearings, the panels can sometimes, and I think it's fairly often, do reach a different conclusion to the Ethical Standards Commissioner. It may be, or they reach the same conclusion but for different reasons. And I think I don't think there's necessarily anything concerning in that. I think that's why you have that separation of functions, and why you have a second look at something. And sometimes it can be because when people give evidence to the Ethical Standards Commissioner, they give it in a different way that when they are giving it under oath or affirmation at a hearing, it comes across really quite differently. So it could be because of that. Sometimes it is a matter of interpreting. A lot of the provisions in the code are subject to interpretation. Things like respect, bullying and harassment are subjective. And so, so it can be that there's a difference in how it's interpreted. But and I think that's important. An important reason why there's a kind of the second line, as it were, the kind of the scrutiny of those decisions at hearings.
That's great. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thanks very much, Megan. I think that's actually interesting, that difference of how evidence comes forward under oath as opposed to not under oath. And that's just to hear that process. That's part of the process, and another reason why we maybe need those 2 stages that process goes through. Just going to bring in Emma Roddick with a couple of questions.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, further to that table, it also shows that the Commissioner had referred 9 reports where he'd assessed that no breach had taken place, but the Commission held hearings nevertheless. So could witnesses talk us through the reasons for that?
Yeah, again, I think with his no breaches included in those, the numbers for his no breaches are ones where he has on the face of it found a breach of the code, but then looked at Article 10 and the right to freedom of expression, and said because of that formal finding can't be found. And in some of those cases, the Standards Commission considered it was proportionate and in the public interest to hold a hearing to kind of explore those Article 10 issues. I think actually our table is slightly misleading because I think for a number of those cases, I can't remember the number I worked out, but I think it was 4 of those cases, the Standards Commission found no breach because of Article 10 in respect of some of the issues, but because other issues were just a no breach, they've been logged under that table as a no breach. So apologies, that table is slightly, I think, misleading. But yeah, it can be at hearings that the panels just interpret the provisions or interpret, especially Article 10, differently to the Commissioner. But we talk to the Commissioner all the time. We share, obviously, we send him the findings. We discuss those with him, with a view to everybody trying to learn from decisions and how cases are presented.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and actually leads on to the next question I had, because the annual report does refer to one of those cases where Article 10 comes into play, and I wondered if we could get a bit more information on that situation, and particularly whether you believe that the code needs to be rewritten.
I don't think the code needs to be rewritten.
Okay.
It's the code requires councillors to behave with courtesy and respect when they're acting in that capacity, or when they could be perceived as acting in that capacity. But when assessing whether a formal finding of the code, the law says that you have to take into account someone's right to freedom of expression under Article 10 of the ECHR, and that does involve interpretation, and we prefer not to have to apply Article 10, in that we would prefer that everybody behaved with courtesy and respect, and that we didn't have to do that balancing act between the courtesy and respect and right to freedom of expression, but we do, and that's law. So I don't think the code necessarily needs amended. Within Article 10, there's obviously the way it's interpreted. You know, you can't say in this situation Article 10 would provide protection, and in this situation wouldn't, because it's very much fact dependent on the individual facts and circumstances. You know, whether the conduct was maybe directed towards a fellow councillor in more of a political environment where you would expect more protection for your freedom of expression, or whether it's maybe an individual correspondence towards a constituent. You know, the less protection would be afforded, you know, in those scenarios. So it really just is very sort of fact specific. Sorry, did that answer the question?
Yeah. I'm wondering then, do you feel that in every case where this has been relevant, there's been a consistent approach, and that it's clear to everyone involved where the line is? Yeah,
I mean, I like to think that hearing panels have adopted a consistent approach. It's something that we are really careful about. We've got guidance on Article 10 and how hearing panels apply issues surrounding Article 10 at hearings. So, yeah, we like to think it's consistent. Whether it's clear to everyone, Article 10 is a really complex subject. You know, so whether that is clear to everyone, probably not. But the code is very clear on the behaviours that are expected in terms of courtesy and respect. So my kind of view is, if you're behaving with courtesy and respect, then you're not going to fall foul of the code. So you don't need to worry about Article 10, essentially.
I suppose the fact that these complaints have been made when it's been found that there's not been a breach thanks to Article 10 shows that at least on the part of complainers there's not that understanding. What more can be done to promote that?
Yeah, I mean, as the Ethical Standards Commissioner says, we are, both organisations are trying to do more work to kind of promote public understanding of the codes. We produced a card that councillors can give to constituents explaining what the code does and doesn't cover, and I think that's been really well received. We've got information on our website. We've done videos for the public on the codes and what they cover and what they don't cover. So we're trying to do as much as we can to kind of educate the public. There's certain situations where, because it is subjective, whether someone's been disrespectful or not, you know, you'll see complaints that come in that you would go, how could anybody think of that as being disrespectful? But those people will make that complaint, I think, almost regardless of the information that you put out there.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm just making a note to put that out on socials in the future. Now going to bring in Mark Griffin, who's joining us online.
Thank you. Good morning. In England, there was a recent survey which showed that 43% of people trusted local councillors to work in the best interest of people in their own area. And I just wonder if there has been any similar research done in Scotland, or if you plan on doing any research at all. And really just to get your take from the Standards Commission point of view on how strong you feel the bond of trust is between the public and our local councillors.
I think the number of complaints about issues such as failing to declare interests or gifts and hospitality, because those type of complaints have reduced, I feel those are quite the trust kind of complaints. You know, that you're trusting councillors to make decisions in the public's best interest rather than their own interests of friends and family or whatever. So I think the reduction in those types of complaints is maybe indicative of there being a certain level of trust. In terms of the rise in respect cases, I guess you could argue that the public doesn't trust politicians to behave, you know, with respect and with courtesy and or whatever it is. But I think that is different from the type of complaints that, like I say, that are much more to do with, you know, how public money is being expended, or decisions that they're actually making.
Yeah, we've discussed this in the past, and certainly with a previous work hat on, if you like, one of the things that you would need to do, I think, to sample that most effectively would be to buy questions in a social attitudes survey, a kind of wider public survey. But we're tiny and we wouldn't have the resources, the financial resources to be able to do that. But that would be the most cost-effective way, I think, of getting that kind of 1,000+ sample, if you like, of the general public, is to include it in those kind of annual public surveys that happen.
And in terms of the England kind of comparator, they don't have the centralised system that we have. It's councils, complaints about councillors' behaviour go to individual councils. They don't have a body like the Ethical Standards Commission or the Standards Commission in England and Wales. Sorry, they do in Wales and have it in Northern Ireland. They don't have it in England.
Okay, thanks for that. My other question was about the joint letters that were sent to the Scottish Government from the Commission and the Ethical Standards Commission, asking that legislation be amended to give the option of finding a breach without holding a hearing. I just wonder if you could expand on what was the reason behind that proposal?
Yeah, it's really trying to secure best value. It would be in cases where the respondent accepts that they breached the code. So it would be trying to find a way of making such a finding without holding the hearing. And then the Standards Commission would only then perhaps need to hold a hearing, whether that be done by letter or actually in person or whatever, on the sanction part, the mitigation and what sanction to apply. So it's really, at the moment, if a respondent says, yep, hands up, I should have declared that interest, I absolutely accept I've breached the code. To make that finding, we still have to hold a hearing. So it was really to try and give us the option that we wouldn't have to do that.
I think, sort of around 25 years, if you like, after the Act, then it's really the changes that we've looked at are really examples where we think maybe just a bit of greater clarity might be needed, or more efficiency. Things could be managed more effectively. And I think they're just things that we've learned over time. They're not indicative of any kind of major underlying problem. They're just, those changes are just ways in which we think the system could be run better and more effectively for everybody concerned, whether that's us or respondents or complainers.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, certainly makes sense. We're going to stay online, and I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor with a couple of questions. Patience. Try saying something. Maybe you're there.
I think that might be me now.
Okay, great.
Thanks, convener, and good morning to the panel. It's actually just following on from Mark Griffin's line of questioning there about the letter to the Scottish Government that's been mentioned. This letter also proposes that legislation be amended to allow the SCS to consider previous breaches by a respondent when determining the sanction to be applied for any new contravention. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on to what extent you feel that repeat offenders, if you like, are a problem, and what impact do you feel this proposal will have?
Yeah, again, we actually can look at, and our sanctions policy says that we will look at previous contraventions of the same type of provision in the code. So it's really just making that clear in legislation that that's something that we will do. So that was more of just a kind of, when we were looking at the Act, as Suzanne said, we were looking to see what kind of tweaks or improvements could be made, so that it wasn't that we think that that's an essential thing that's missing. And it's not something that we have huge difficulty with in terms of, I guess, repeat offenders. It's not something we see a lot of.
Okay. So that repeat offenders term, for want of a better phrase, I suppose, that's not something that's happening a lot. There's no individuals that are, consistently coming back.
No, not at all. I think it was maybe 4 years ago we had a councillor who was disqualified, and it was the first disqualification I think we'd ever done, and that was somebody who'd been before us twice before for the same type of issues. So, but we've not had anything like that since.
Okay, that's great. A second question, if that's all right, thanks. Is the Commission would like to see the inclusion of new powers and a clear route for the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body to remove or replace an incumbent SCS member or the Ethical Standards Commissioner. Could you say why you think that this amendment is required?
Yeah, again, it's just when we were looking through the Act and potential improvements, we thought that that was something that was missing, that kind of clear route. I think the Ethical Standards Commissioner mentioned it earlier, that when there was difficulties with his predecessor, it might have been helpful to have a clearer route to kind of address some of those difficulties. But it's certainly not because we think there's any problem with any of our Commission members or anything like that. It's just purely to give a kind of clearer route.
Reassuring for your members to get that on the record. That's me, Convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fulton. And okay, and I'm going to bring back Willie Coffey with a final question.
Thanks very much, Convener. I should probably have asked Ian Bruce this, but Lorna, I wonder if I could just pose the question a bit. Do we know what proportion of complaints that were deemed to be not relevant came from councillors who hadn't themselves undergone training on the Code of Conduct?
Yeah, I think you would have to ask. That would have to be, because we don't see the ones that are rejected as inadmissible. Just to bear in mind that it's actually quite a small percentage of complaints that are councillor complaining about other councillors. It is still the vast majority do come from members of the public. So, but that's a question you would have to put to the Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. We will do.
Okay. Thanks very much. That brings us to the end of our session. Really very much appreciate both of you coming in to give us a bit of detail on your report. And I'm now going to suspend the meeting to allow for a change of witnesses. Thank you. Thank you. The next item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the Scottish Government's short-term Let's implementation update from Paul McLennan, who's our Housing Minister. And the Minister is joined by Scottish Government officials, Andy Kinnaird, who's the head of Transforming Planning, Margaret Main, who's a lawyer at the Legal Directorate, and Anita Stewart, who is the policy team leader. And before we turn to questions from members, I invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak at this year's Short-Term Let's Implementation Update report and answer questions about evidence you've gathered from stakeholders. I note that the committee received 19 responses in total, just under half being from local authorities, and a third from industry organisations, with the remainder from government bodies, festival organisations and 2 community groups. Everything included in these responses mirrors the views already shared with the Scottish Government. We were confused with a few local authorities who said we didn't involve them as we had, and they contributed to the report. From reading some responses also you received, there was perhaps a misunderstanding between engagement we did for the report and obviously the call for evidence that the committee did. As the report outlines, the feedback we received broadly fell under the following headings: calls to improve guidance, calls to amend legislation, and asks that were out of scope. We have committed to actions to address the first 2, and I note the evidence you received broadly endorses this approach. Considerable feedback was gathered from a range of stakeholders and sources. We've been careful not to draw conclusions, and we feel there is not yet sufficient data available to assess impacts. The report provides early insights and information on initial short-term licence application levels across Scotland, considers current operational processes and identifies operational improvements, including Scottish Government actions where appropriate. We've already made operational adjustments to the licensing scheme that have been made as a direct result of feedback from a range of stakeholders. I understand some groups within the sector want us to halt the present regulation and undertake a review. We have committed to ongoing monitoring, but it would not be responsible to review regulation that has only just been implemented and is still within a transitional phase. Especially as the sector is invested in compliance and licensing and is meeting its purpose to ensure consistent safety standards. We will continue to work with and listen to stakeholders. I am pleased to inform the committee, as well as regular engagement we already have in place, the first meeting of the guidance expert group being facilitated by Visit Scotland will take place later this month. We've already said that we are open to undertaking further consultation once the guidance work concludes, which cannot be addressed through guidance, and we need to gather wider views on before deciding how to proceed. I am happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Thanks very much for that opening statement. I'd like to begin with home sharing and letting. So that was something that actually came up, I think, a while ago when we were considering this. And I'd be interested to hear an explanation of why you choose not to consider areas of significant stakeholder concern, such as the home sharing and letting, in the licensing regime as part of the update process.
I think I'll bring Anita in a wee second. Obviously, he's been dealing with that as well. I think in terms of that, when we set out I suppose the wider scheme, we obviously talked around about B&Bs, we talked around about guest houses, which we've talked about previously in here as well. And I think in terms of the home letting, it was a case of seeing how that kind of settled down as well in terms of that. And we've issued guidance to local authorities based on that particular point. I think the point I made right at the very start of the process was trying to make sure that this is all around about safety and compliance in terms of that, and that's a paramount importance in terms of what we're looking for in terms of that. But I'll bring in Anita as well, just to add in anything that she wanted to talk about that particular point.
Thank you. We have spoken to a range of different stakeholders as part of this work, as you're aware. And we've heard from some organisations that run different home exchange models that felt that it shouldn't be included. I think what we wanted to do is look at that through the guidance work that we've got planned, and then take wider views to understand potentially what others feel on this, and then after that, then decide what steps to take next.
Okay, so there's a bit of a process
Yes.
before you might get to that place. Okay, that's good to hear. We've heard from short-term lets providers that the Scottish they've got concerns that the Scottish Government's downplayed their concerns in the update report, and I'd be interested to hear your response to this.
I think one of the key things right from the very outset, and you'll know, convener, I was on the committee when we first discussed this as a committee and listened to some of the concerns about it at that particular time. In terms of engagement, I think government ministers have met with the SSC, for example, on a number of occasions. Probably around, I think it's about 10, and I think I've met with the SSC on 7 occasions so far. So we're obviously listening to them on a regular basis in terms of that. We also have met and engaged with the STA. We obviously look at the likes of the Bookings.com, Airbnb and so on, and spoke to them on a number of occasions as well. And indeed met with the previous First Minister, Mr Youssef, and the current Deputy First Minister with them as well, talking about that. And they endorsed our approach in terms of looking at the review and looking at in terms of what we need to do and see how that kind of beds down. So we have been listening to them. We might not have agreed on all the points that they've raised, but we've certainly listened to them in terms of that, and it's not downplaying. I said it's part of the process and saying, look, let's look at the implementation update, let it bed down a little bit. We've made changes already. We have listened. We'll continue to listen. And I made that commitment to them when we met with them previously. We've also engaged, for example, with SOLAR, who obviously are the licensing bodies and local authorities who also get feedback from the sector itself in terms of that, in terms of in times to process applications, in terms of how they assess on their own local, I suppose, interpretation. And we've tried to work with them in terms of that. So we've worked with them, as I said, face to face. We've worked with them through local authorities in terms to pick up the issues that they've had with local authorities as well. And we've issued further guidance if required, that we're following feedback from likes of the ESSC, STA, for example, in terms of that. So very much an ongoing process, and we've mentioned that to them on regular occasions.
Thanks very much for that. I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher with a brief supplementary.
Thank you very much, Convener. And on the point that you made there, Minister, in terms of committing to the review, but we don't have any further actions at this point in time. But what we have seen, and we're a year on since the introduction of short-term lets, is there's been increases in terms of rents and hotel prices. And if you look at one platform for guest bookings for the Edinburgh Fringe, the world-renowned festival, it's dropped 13% as supply constraints priced out guests and performers. So does the Minister think that the short-term lets policy as it stands is working? Because if you look specifically at the rents and hotel prices that have soared right through our capital, you know, we're seeing that the average hotel price in Edinburgh has rose to a record high over the last year, increasing by 11.5%. That's double our national average. So what's the Minister's response to this, and does he therefore understand the frustration by the sector who feel that the government are not moving quickly enough in order to resolve the issues with the short-term lets policy?
I think there's a number of things in terms of that. I think when you look at Edinburgh, for example, I think Edinburgh needs to be looked at very much on its own. I had meetings with the festival and the festival Fringe, so we tried to be as accommodating with them, and we met with the council as well to try to be accommodating as possible about exemptions, and these were really positive meetings. I think in terms of Edinburgh, there's a capacity issue in terms of that. If we're talking about Taylor Swift's been mentioned, the next Oasis concert's been mentioned. There's a piece of work I think that the council needs to take in terms of the capacity the city can actually take, and I think that's really important. So when we see the issue of short-term lets being compared with, you know, when Taylor Swift was here or other events are kind of going on, there's a broader capacity issue I think Edinburgh needs to look at. And I've discussed this with Edinburgh in terms of that. So how you know, what can Edinburgh actually take? So it is a case of supply and demand. Short-term lets, you might think has a role in that, but the much broader supply and demand, is there enough hotel space for a Taylor Swift event, for an Oasis event? That's something that the council needs to look at. So trying to compare just that with short-term lets, I don't think is best a comparison as possible. And I think that's one of the things Edinburgh needs to do, is look at its capacity for events. And it's a similar type of thing, for example, if we're looking at the Commonwealth Games. As part of the work that the Commonwealth Games team will be looking at, and in Glasgow, they need to look at in terms of what's the capacity for taking visitors in as well. So that needs to be a broader review in terms of that. And we mentioned that when we spoke to the festivals in terms of that. So I think it's a much broader issue that Edinburgh has to take in terms of that. The short-term lets, I think you might argue as part of that. Now, Edinburgh obviously has a look at it in terms of its own. It's got the short-term lets control area, nothing to do with licensing as such. But again, it has the right and was given authority from Scottish Government, and as has any local authority, to go and look at short-term lets control areas in terms of that. But the issue around about Edinburgh, I think, is very much about capacity, not just around about short-term lets.
So I've got a little bit of interest in this area. So Willie, before I bring you in, I'm going to go to Alexander Stewart and then come in to Emma Roddick with brief supplementaries.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, we're well aware of the organisations and structures who have got issues with this, and one of the biggest one was the bed and breakfast associations, who they said in some of their evidence that it was by far the worst example of policy implementation they've ever had to encounter as a sector, because they saw it as fragmented, it was inconsistent, it was arbitrary, it was onerous and costly. So these are some of the areas that they have concerns with. And you talked about the health and safety rules applying in this process. Now, organisations like those, they are compliant with health and safety rules already, with reference to inspection and enforcement. So how would you, Minister, respond to the analysis that they've had that is relatively scathing about how this has impacted their sector?
I think there's a number of things. It spoke to them also. I think some of the general feedback has been around about, because for me, going right back to when this policy was brought in, there was a discussion and decision at that time, was it going to be a national scheme or was it going to be a local scheme, which would have then the local authorities, as there are with many licensing schemes in Scotland, or was it going to be the local authority? It's up to the local authority to interpret the guidance in terms of how they do that. At the start of the process, I think each local authority interpreted that on a slightly different basis. So we kind of picked up that. We've had meetings with Solar, for example, to try and pick up that, who are the licensing bodies that represent, licensing group that represents licensing authorities in Scotland, to try and identify that. So there was some guidance issued in terms of that. If there was an issue around about how one authority interpreted part of the licensing with another, we tried to speak to them on a regular basis. I'll bring Anita in to talk a little bit more about the involvement she had with the local authorities and to try and do that. So it is trying to get that national consistency, but with local interpretation. I think part of the review that we're talking about is trying to look at that and see what we can do to further strengthen that guidance. But Anita, as I said, spoke directly to Alexa Solar and so on. So Anita, I don't know if you want to say any more just about the work you've done around about that particular point.
I think you've covered it really well, Minister, actually, in terms of the rationale, I suppose, behind it being a local scheme, which mirrors other regulations that are in place for other different types of businesses, so that you've still got that consistency about the safety standards across Scotland, but then you have also got the flexibility where local authorities can look and see the circumstances in their areas in terms of if there's any particular things that need to be taken account of, or indeed any particular application. Yes, we have worked with authorities to look at how we can facilitate a common approach where it's possible. So, for example, I think you may have heard this before, when we work with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to look at a common approach to applications, to make it better and more user-friendly for the applicant, etc., and also for the processing of the body that's doing it in terms of the consultation. So this work continues. It's not done in isolation. We are working and looking at this in terms of that operational improvement, linking up with whether it's Visit Scotland and the Industry Advisory Group. That's the intention going forward. But as I say, the main thing at the moment, I think, is really to do that guidance review first, and then from that, look and see actually where there are things that we may need to take more views on before deciding further actions.
Thank you.
Thanks. Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Minister. I wanted to pick up on comments there around exemption discussions with City of Edinburgh Council. I'm aware that Living Rent has raised concerns around exemptions being granted for most of the year around festivals and major events. I have to stay here during the week quite a bit, and it seems like there's always an event Particularly during the likes of Taylor Swift, there were sofas going for 4 figures a night. So does the Minister recognise that operators can very easily make most of the money that they would throughout a whole year simply during these events? And is it in the spirit of the scheme for these to be exempted?
I'll clarify this because, I mean, as far as I'm aware, the only exemption that Edinburgh had was in terms of the festival and so on. Because I think I mentioned previously about having the discussions with Edinburgh Council, the festival and Fringe, around about how we could maximise exemptions around about that. Just to talk about the capacity issues that Megan Gallagher had talked about, and I think, you know, Edinburgh may come back to us, for example, and about Taylor Swift. They may come back to us about Oasis. I'm not aware of that in terms of that as yet. I'm not aware if Anita's anywhere of any other exemptions, but that certainly was the ones that, you know, that we'd be looking at. And coming back to some of the issues, for example, if it's about Oasis or Taylor Swift or any other big event, it does come back. And this is whether it's Edinburgh, Glasgow, wherever else. There has to be, I think, part of any planning for an event has to have that capacity issue, and how much can a city actually take in terms of, as a short-term lets, as a hotels. What else is available? I think that's a piece of work that needs to be done. Now, that falls kind of out with my remit in terms of that, but it's something that I would always push the local authority to do, is look, what's your actual capacity for taking in an additional 60,000 guests that might be here for 2 or 3 days. But Anita, I don't know if you want to touch on anything else about the exemptions, but the only discussions I've had were around about the festival in Fringe, which have been long established events, as you know, for a period of time.
Thank you. Prior to the amendment that was made by Parliament this year to the licensing legislation, the original legislation said that an operator could, well, first of all, a licensing authority could decide to offer temporary exemptions, and if they did, then a host could apply for a temporary exemption, but it would be for a single period of no more than 6 weeks. The Minister's alluded to those conversations that we had, particularly in Edinburgh, but, you know, talking to other authorities to hear their views as well, on the basis that we need to strike a right balance between the activity and how often it's undertaken, and whether actually that should be something that someone should apply for a full licence for, or whether there should be more flexibility than it just being a single period for 6 weeks. So that's why that amendment earlier this year, it altered it to allow people to have up to 3 periods, but the total could still not be more than 6 weeks. So I think that's something that we're still, you know, obviously keeping an eye on, monitoring, speaking to different stakeholders about, and that we can look at that in amongst other things that we may do after the guidance has been completed.
So if, in the case of whole properties in particular, if a property is being exempted for the festival period, does it not seem unlikely that that would then be used for any other purpose the rest of the year?
I don't know if you want to come on that one. I'm trying to understand the question, but I'll let Anita come back and
I think that's up to, as you said, there's many different events that happen, particularly in Edinburgh through the year. So it's a choice that the host would have to make in terms of what they're particularly going to ask for to have an exemption from the requirement to have a licence, whether they want to do it over Hogmanay, for example, whether they want to do it for the Fringe, or whether they want to do it for a different period. But they can't go over that maximum amount of 6 weeks in a calendar year.
Yeah. So it's a balance about trying to get that flexibility in terms of that, you know, whether it is the odd one-off or a couple of other events, as against, for example, the festival, which runs for, well, I'm saying it runs for a month, but the festival probably is about 2 weeks before when people start to come into the city and start preparing and all that kind of stuff. So it's trying to do that. The discussions I had with the festival and Fringe were around about probably those 6 weeks where it's really key, where you kind of see the visitor numbers really increase in terms of that. So it's trying to have that balance. And this is obviously part of the review that's kind of been looked at the moment. So.
Thanks very much. I'm going to move online and bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to you, Paul. I know you said in your remarks, Paul, that I don't think you have got sufficient data that would allow you to draw firm conclusions at the moment. And of course, we know that some will have made up their minds in the absence of any data whatsoever. But can you give us a wee flavour if there's anything emerging about the implications of the licensing regime in terms of its main aims, to ensure that properties are safe, standards are high, and that there's a route for people to raise issues about antisocial behaviour. So is there anything coming out of the data that you do have that would give us that kind of positive indication that the regime is working?
I think there's a number of things. I think when I remember being in the committee discussing this, Mr Coffey as well, we were talking about, there was an estimate at the time. I think in terms of the applications that have kind of come through, the estimate at the time I think was around about 32,000 properties in terms of that. I think at the moment there's around about, I'm trying to get the exact figures, around about 30,500 just now in terms of that. I think they're expecting these figures to go up to about 35,000. So the figures are ahead of where we thought that was, and I think the figures we have to remember as well were obviously around about COVID time as well. So there obviously would have been businesses struggling around about that time to continue over the COVID period. I think we've seen slight contrast in some of the numbers. Highland, for example, have been very high. Glasgow and Edinburgh have been slightly lower than we expected, but obviously Edinburgh has the short-term let control area, and Glasgow obviously is trying to talk to them about managing or provision of short-term let. So that's talking about the short-term let control areas as against licensing. In terms of, I think the tourism sector itself has been recovering reasonably well in that period of time. It's still an issue, obviously, for the sector to continue during, for example, the cost of living and crisis and so on as well. So I think, broadly speaking, it's slightly ahead of where we've kind of been. The number of short-term lets, I think, is slightly fallen, probably around about 1% or so in terms of that. So it's not a figure that's coming through in terms of that and showing any substantial drops. In terms of that, I think, again, the wider impact, Mr Coffey, again, is to kind of see what kind of happens over the next kind of number of months as well, over Hogmanay, over the next summer period and so on, in terms of that. But I don't know, Anita, do you know if you want to add anything to that at this point?
I think you've covered the safety point, which was represented in the implementation update report, both from the perspective of Scottish Fire and Rescue involvement in assessing applications, Police Scotland looking at fit and proper person aspect, and the local authority obviously looking at the range of documentation that perhaps wasn't there for a lot of applications they were helping support initially, that would reassure, I suppose, about those safety requirements being conducted. So I think that's set out in the report. Anecdotally, Police Scotland have told us that the evidence they provided to committee back at the end of 2021, prior to the legislation being passed, is still relevant in terms of organised crime, etc. That this now, I suppose, provides a mechanism for that to be tackled going forwards.
Just a few other things just to mention. There's a cover, I think the statistics to the end of June were 30,299 licensing applications. I think from public registers and other information, we're expecting that current figures are in about 34,285 at the moment. Now, obviously, there's still local authorities that are still processing, so we expect that figure to be higher as well. And one of the key things to mention as well is that the refusals have been very, very low in terms of that, but not licensing, given the licensing application. So it's been very low in terms of that. So broadly speaking, I think it's slightly ahead of where the estimates were prior to going into the licensing scheme.
In terms of the implementation update report that came out in August, Paul, my understanding is that the data that informs that is basically to the end of 2023, but we've got all that data from January 24 up to August 24 to consider and include. Is there any reason why we didn't include that section of data for the current year that we're in and make it as up to date and current as we possibly could?
I'll bring Anita in on that particular point. I know Anita's been working obviously on the figures over a period of time. Anita, do you want to mention that?
Mr Coffey, are you talking about the official statistics on short-term let licensing applications?
Well, that date is at the end of August, Anita.
Because at the end of August, the published statistics that were available to us took us up until the end of December 2023. Since then, we've published statistics last month, which have taken us up until the end of June this year. And the intention is to publish the next statistics, probably March, April time next year, which will take us up until December 2024. And then we'll be in that normal sort of quarter lag process in terms of publishing. But I should add that I know my colleagues in the statistical team are doing a review, gathering views from different stakeholders about the frequency and the format of those publications going forward. Because a lot of Scottish Government statistics are published annually, for example.
That's really helpful. That clears that point up, Anita. But is there anything emerging from that most recent data then in terms of the main intentions of the policy that support the fact that the policy is either working or perhaps that it could be yet to be improved?
I think the Minister highlighted that the statistics that are available to us until the end of June are a partial picture. We are expecting that to go up. But if we compare what we were told by, anecdotally from authorities or informally by authorities last October when the deadline for existing hosts closed, we knew then that there was probably in the region of about 29,000 applications. And now, if we're going on sort of information from public registers, etc., it's over 34,000. I think that shows that there's still quite a steady rate of applications from new hosts coming in. And talking to authorities, I think that could be where there's, the winter period where a lot of businesses will close, etc. Some of them may decide that they want to sell up, etc. Others will take over, or there's previous operators that have decided that they will do it less often and they'll actually apply for a temporary exemption rather than a full licence, or they've had a break and then they've come back and applied for a full licence. So I think that's showing that there's still, we're still not seeing a full picture to understand the operators that were there prior to licensing starting, how they're fully engaging with the current system, and then understanding how many new operators are coming on board as well.
Okay.
But it's definitely in terms of the numbers of operators that are there and the consistency, etc. It's providing assurance to guests, I suppose, that come into Scotland. Means that you're assured that there's going to be certain checks that will have been undertaken and requirements that will be in place when you stay in a short-term let.
Okay, thanks for that, Anita. Thank you, Paul. Convener?
Thanks very much, Willie. I'm going to stay online and I'm going to bring in Mark Griffin with a couple of questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Convener. I just had a couple of questions about the proposed expert group, Minister. Just to ask what the remit of the group will be and who it will report to, how members will be appointed and who would provide the secretariat.
I'll bring Anita in that second, Mr. Governor. I think that the important part, right at the start process, we said we were going to, in terms of discussing this, we would pull this group together because I think it's incredibly important. One is going through the implementation updates, what we do going forward, and I think that's incredibly important around about that. We've met a number of Visit Scotland and a number of other groups and part of that who also have the interest in terms of that. In terms of the group itself, the remit and the membership and timescales, Anita's been dealing with that. I'll bring Anita in and come back after Anita's given a little bit more detail about the logistics and why we pulled the group together.
The group is primarily to look at Scottish Government guidance on the licensing and the planning of short-term lets. We have got a number of matters that were raised with us through the ongoing monitoring that we're undertaking. So we've got that as a starter for 10, but the purpose of the group will be to take those and anything else when they work through those different guidance that we have for licensing and planning to determine and make recommendations to government about any changes. We've asked Visit Scotland to convene that group and to facilitate it, so it will be chaired by a director at Visit Scotland. And then we have representation on the group from SOLAR, which is the Society of Law Officers of Scotland, representatives from licensing authorities, representatives from planning authorities, industry representation, and it will be a very technical nature, the group, as you would imagine. So Visit Scotland are coordinating that, with the first meeting taking place at the end of this month, with the expectation that we would have the revised suggested guidance to the Scottish Government early in the new year.
Mr. Griffin, happy to write to the committee on that after the recommendations come forward, and we've had a look at these, but happy to write to the committee on that particular point.
Thanks, that would be welcome. Mark.
Thanks for that. It's helpful to hear that one of the first issues the expert group will look at is that crossover between planning and licensing, because we have heard concerns from in written evidence about the interface between planning and licensing, claims that they work separately and sometimes at odds with each other. And so I just wonder, Minister, if you've got any early plans on how those two regulatory regimes are streamlined when it comes to applying to short-term lets, and how perhaps they work better together.
I'll bring in Andy Kinnear in a little while. I think obviously we've had various proposals, for example, around about how we make that process a lot quicker. I think it comes down to if you take away in Edinburgh, for example, in terms of its short-term lets control area, that's obviously the ability to do that, as is every other local authority has that. I know Highland Council are looking at an area or two at the moment. That's their ability. That's separate. That's from a planning point of view. In terms of licensing, I think one of the key things it's kind of come up is around about if there's a licensing application going in, is there a material change of use, a material change in terms of that. And again, that's been up to each local authority to kind of look at that. I need to talk around about the broader review that the group's going to look at, that's going to be chaired with Visit Scotland, so that will go into that in a little bit more detail. But I'll bring in Andy just in terms of, and because I know Andy's been looking at this as well, in terms of the process of licensing and planning. Any other comments he wants to make?
Yeah, thanks, Minister. So the opportunities and impacts on places of short-term lets are sort of different in different parts of the country, and even sort of within different communities too. So it does mean that authorities can take different approaches to how they manage the planning aspects of that, and how they choose to link or not link in too closely with the licensing regime as well. And there's no obligation on licensing authorities to carry out a planning assessment in handling the licence, but kind of recognising that some authorities will be more interested in using their planning controls than others. That does kind of lead to some sort of different approaches happening across the country, but that's the nature of planning.
Again, I think the important point, Mr. Griffin, is in terms of the expert group being pulled together, it's trying to look at that in a little bit more detail and see what the recommendations of the group can you come up with. But I think it is down to the local interpretation. Each local authority in terms of planning, not just in terms of short-term lets, will have different interpretations of how they look at planning guidance, and I think that's the key thing. But we'll listen to what the expert group says, and obviously discuss it with planning colleagues also.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. The committee have heard that when it comes to lack of enforcement action against unlicensed operators, potentially due to the licensing authorities being unable to recoup enforcement costs, can I ask, do you have any plans, or is there anything in the line that you intend to support authorities wishing to take action of this enforcement action? Is there any plans you've got in place to try and support that?
Again, I think I'll bring in Anita on the specifics. I think in terms of, because that was an issue that was raised during the start when we were discussing it at that rate. I think, again, it was very much depending on what's the actual issue that's been caused in terms of that. I think we obviously was discussed with the police as well, Scottish Police, and I know Anita has kind of talked about that and what we need to do with local authorities. It's not an issue that I've been, it's been widely abused or used at this particular time. I think it very much depends on, would it be Edinburgh, would it be Highlands? It would again depend on that particular time. So, and again, this was part of looking at the review in terms of, has this been a significant issue kind of going forward? I'll bring Anita in terms of that. Now I'm aware there's not been any significant issues of any significant number in terms of that. But again, it would be very much, I think, down to where the local authority is, what the issue is, and what we need to do to make sure that that's the case. But Anita, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
In terms of enforcement, the Civic Government Act sets out quite clearly what the enforcement is for licence holders. So that's quite an established process. In terms of, if you're asking about enforcement of unlicensed operators, with the report outlines that Police Scotland have been working, their local teams have been working with licensed authorities to look at this, I suppose, recognising that it's a transitional period. There's an approach here to balance and consider proportionate action around this, and to take a sort of an encourage, educate approach, rather than with the last resort potentially being enforcement. So that is what we're hearing across Scotland when we talk to authorities. I think that has taken time to happen across different areas for it to develop, depending on the relationships that were already there between the licensing and the police and how they actively took forward this for other licensing regimes. But that is, I think over time, I think we will see, obviously cases come forward that will be enforced, and licensing authorities will have a look in terms of their own processes, and how they take this forward, and they deal with complaints that are brought to them about people complaining, my neighbour is operating, they haven't got a licence, etc. And that goes through a particular process. I don't know if the Minister wants to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's like, excuse me, coming from a local authority background as well, there's obviously different licensing regimes that operate there. And it is very much, if there's a complaint received, that will be investigated. Is there something that can be discussed before it actually gets to, even before it gets to the enforcement stage? So there's always that stage. Enforcement's always going to be the last resort in terms of that. So we've seen that in previous regimes, in any licensing regimes. It's always to try and have that discussion, to try and alleviate the problem. If not, enforcement's the last kind of resort. And I think, as Anita kind of said, it's making sure, speaking to local authorities and the police authorities, if it's reported, what's the best way to kind of deal with that. And there will be local approaches, but it is almost following the kind of regimes and licensing schemes just now. Talk to people, try and alleviate it, take the problem away. If not, then enforcement's obviously the last resort. We can't have people operating illegally either in this or under any other licensing scheme in terms of that. So it's very much following the current procedures that are there for existing licensing schemes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And I'm now going to go back online and bring in Fulton McGregor with a couple of questions.
Thank you, Convener. I think that's me. Thanks, Convener. And good morning to the Minister and to his team. It's following on from the last line of questioning there, but licence authorities have asked for clarity on the operation of licence transfers, provisional licensing, and also about home swaps. Minister, do you intend to provide additional guidance or update regulations in these areas? And do you know if you are and when this might happen?
We have already done that on a number of occasions, Mr Gregor, in terms of that. And obviously, there's a number of things we pick up from a number of sources. One was obviously talking to SOLA, so that's the actual licensing authorities and the feedback that they get from that particular point. There's been interpretations of some planning of licensing from different local authorities, so we've also consulted and talked to and issued guidance, not only to the specific local authorities, but to all local authorities in terms of that. The implementation update was almost trying to pick up that as well, and I think we talked about who the feedback was from. Obviously, it was from SOLA, it was from local authorities, and it was from organisations, obviously, that represent the sector as well. So we've already done that over that period of time, and I think that's kind of been outlined in the report. We talked about expert groups, so we'll see what the expert group come out and say and what they think we should be looking at in terms of that. So I would imagine at some stage, when the expert group reports back, we'll be looking at some of the recommendations and assessing these, and obviously then contacting local authorities and so on at that particular point. Anita, I know you've had individual discussions with local authorities in terms of that as well. So I'll bring Anita in as well, Mr McGregor, but in terms of that, we've already done that as best we can to try and get that consistency, but leaving that flexibility for the local approach, which is of course really important. But Anita, I don't know if you want to come in and just give a flavour of some of the discussions you've had with some local authorities.
When the amendment order was made and came into force at the end of August, we published at the same time an update to our guidance to include sections about the processing of licence transfers and provisional licences. And I don't know if I'm okay to bounce it off over to Margaret as well, but in terms of the provisions that have been put in around the transfer of licences, that's actually based on arrangements that are already there for liquor licensing under the Licensing Act 2005. So it's an established process that's in place.
I don't know if we've got anything else to add to that. As has been said, the review group, the expert group, will look at any of the issues around provisional licences, transfers, etc. The provisions on transfers appear to be clear in the legislation, but we're open to hearing from the expert group on their views, and thereafter look at any need for any tightening or changing of the regulations themselves.
Oh, okay, thanks very much for that. And Minister, moving on to another question. It's obviously been well documented that licence authorities have made it clear, and they've told this committee, that 9 months is not sufficient in their view to process the most complex of applications. What consideration are you giving to extending that deadline?
Again, you've probably seen, Mr McGregor, in terms of most applications that have kind of come through, there has been areas where there's been high level of applications. For example, Highland have demonstrated that, and I think there was some anecdotal evidence around about applications coming in very much late in the process, which is in terms of that. So again, we've been in discussions with individual local authorities in terms of the general numbers, but in terms of complex cases, that's something we'll discuss with local authorities in terms of where they are as well. So there's always discussions going on with SOLAR, for example, and individual local authorities, where there's been that much higher level of applications than we expected. And there will be a degree of complexity in some cases. So again, that would be discussed local authority by local authority in terms of that. And these discussions go on a very regular basis in terms of that. So, and the key message to get across there is, if they're an existing application, if an existing holder as well, then obviously they're allowed to still to operate. In terms of a new application coming in, and obviously it's an interest to make sure that the correct information and everything else comes through as quickly as possible. But if they were an existing operator before an application can come in, of course they can still then continue to operate over that period of time. Again, I don't know if Anita wants to add anything, but we've had discussions with local authorities that have much higher numbers of applications than they expected at the time, which is obviously a good sign for the local authority themselves. But Anita, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think in terms of what you covered there, Minister, it's outlining that for this transitional phase for existing hosts, licensing authorities did actually have 12 months to process those, and it's for the new hosts that it's the 9-month period. I think we're sort of moving in, once the transitional period ends, we're moving into this more steady state and seeing it fully embed. And I think we obviously still talk to authorities to understand how the processing times are for those new applications that are coming through from new hosts, to see what the average processing times are. But the 9 months is the set period that's in there for the rest of the Civic Government Act. So I don't believe there's any plans at the moment for us to sort of alter that, but we would obviously keep it under review.
Yeah, I think on that point, Mr. Mcgregor, I think the vast majority of cases, within that should obviously be dealt with within that period of time. You would expect if there was a case of complexity that the local authority would build that into that timescale as well, knowing if it was a complex issue and it required various pieces of information. But the local authority should be assessing that when it comes in at the start of the process. But we haven't, I think as Anita said, we're having discussed with individual local authorities in terms of that. So.
Okay, I was actually going to ask a follow-up there, Minister, but you've went on and answered it, so thanks very much. And Convener, that's me.
Thanks very much, Fulton. And we're now going over to our final questions with Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, could you set out how you intend to monitor and review the operation of short-term let licensing in the future? And in particular, when can we expect to see key milestones like the reports from the expert group and future updates from the Scottish Government?
I think we've kind of touched on that, but I'll kind of clarify in terms of that. I think one of the key things when I was first in the committee was, when we raised this when I was in the committee, was talking about the ongoing monitoring, because that was really important. I think a general point to make when this has been brought in is there's been no ongoing process of engagement, and I think that's really important. We've had a number of meetings with the SSC, with the STEA, with SOLA, with the expert groups that Visit Scotland over a period of time. So it's almost building in that informal monitoring, I think, in terms of that. So there's been numerous meetings discussed in terms of that. We talked around about the amendment order, which demonstrated we were listening, and are still continuing to do that. I think in terms of the expert group, it's very much listening to the sector itself. It's and going out. I think the implementation update showed some responses. I think the expert group, for people who are actually working in the sector and coming back and making recommendations, shows that we're willing to listen in terms of that. And said I would obviously contact and write to the committee around about what that kind of comes through. And I think Anita talked about the timescales for that, so it's not a long period of time in terms of that, but it's important that we try and look at probably as we get towards next summer. What do we need to do? Anything? Do we need to change anything in terms of what the expert group is saying in terms of that? And I think what we'll do obviously is come back with an implementation update again in 2025. So it's an ongoing process, which I think is really important. We've demonstrated we're listening. We're listening. Not every comment we have we've agreed with, as you would expect in any form of government, but we have demonstrated we're listening. We've demonstrated we're continuing to listen to the expert groups as well. Coming back to committee, and obviously it's coming back to as I said, coming back about the update report also. And if we think we need to do anything else around about that, then we'll obviously come back and see. I think that one of the key things would be what the expert group comes back with in terms of recommendations. It may be some of the things they would want us to look in more detail. We'll consider what the report says and come back at that stage.
Okay, thank you. One thing that the implementation update doesn't mention is issues raised by local authorities around not feeling able to take action against those who are applying for alcohol licences in an apparent attempt to avoid being captured by the short-term licensing orders, even when it's clear that there's no alcohol being served on the premises. Is the Minister still looking at this problem, and will there be any work done to ensure that loopholes are closed?
We have. I'll maybe bring in colleagues just to talk about, obviously, from I suppose what we need to do in that from a legal point of view, and in terms of that. And I think that is obviously we've been aware of some applications that have kind of come through on that. I think it comes back to the point that Mr. Stewart mentioned, is there, in terms of that, is there, because I think if they are applying for a licence and there's not anything there legally, where does that kind of sit? But Anita, and I'll bring Anita in as well initially to talk around about that at this stage, and obviously talk to Margaret as well around about the legal aspects of that. But Anita, I don't know if you want to add on that, but that is something that's been raised with us.
I was just refreshing myself, looking at the transcript from the previous committee on this in June. So I was just reflecting that point was raised actually, and Margaret's colleague Craig McGuffey responded just to say that it's something that we would need to take wider views on before we would decide if we felt it needed further action taken. So I think that's something that we can continue to talk to authorities about to understand, but it would fall into the bracket post guidance review to understand then what have we got, what wider views do we need to take before we would look at something in that respect, because it would have it would be quite a big change, I suppose, in terms of people that had an exclusion at the moment because they've got a liquor licence, or under the Licensing Act 2005. If that then took that away and they needed to have a short-term licence, so it needs more due diligence, more work to understand what the impacts of that might be, and if it's required as well.
On that point.
Just to say that absolutely there is currently an exemption from obtaining a short-term let licence under the current provisions where an applicant already has a premises licence under the Licensing Scotland Act. I agree with my colleagues' earlier expressed views that this would be something we'd need to consider the pros and cons of in terms of removing that exemption from people who've already gone through a fit and proper person test, etc., to have to do that again. So we'd have to weigh up the pros and cons, and the proper way to do that would be through consultation in relation to our proposed amendment.
It has been a significant amount of time already since I raised this with you, Minister. Has any steps been taken so far to get those views?
I think part obviously was in terms of the implementation update was part of that. I think the other thing, obviously, we talked about the expert group as well, and I think one of the key things we need to take back to that as well is in terms of what's been, because I think what's come out today needs to feed in to part of that, to the discussion with the expert group. I know the expert group's been set up there and it's talked about Visit Scotland and they're chairing it. But I think in terms of what kind of comes out of the committee today and what's been raised by colleagues today is something that we need to mention and obviously give a read out to colleagues in the expert group around about that. So I think you've got the commitment we've heard around about that is looking at the pros and cons about that. I think that's something we need to look at as part of the expert group and what we need to do that. And happy to come back and write to yourself, in the committee, around about what the considerations are in terms of that, because I think it's an important point that you raise.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Well, that was our the end of our questions. So thanks so much for joining us this morning to give us the implementation update. I think it's been very useful to understand what's going on and what you're intending to do into the future as well. And as we previously agreed to take the next items in private, that was the last public item on our agenda for today. I now close the public part of the meeting.